Been a crazy week in the NFL, and the QB market is red hot. Is there a chance that Kirk Cousins could be the next one moved? What would it look like? What are the potential landing spots? All that and much more on this week's episode of the State of Purple podcast with Jack Day and Aj Mansour.
Seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side. Off by Diggs. Stay up. Oh my God! 30. No 10. Touchdown! Are you kidding me? Miracle finish. It's a Minneapolis miracle. Oh my God! No way! What a miracle finish!
Hey, welcome to the State of Purple podcast. Aj Mansour, Jack Day, KFAN's Minnesota Vikings podcast. Jack Day, how are you, my man?
Doing well. Looking forward to talking more about it hasn't been super eventful on the Vikings side of things, but it's been an extremely eventful week for the rest of the NFL.
Yeah, no, it's been a crazy week, and it's I think only beginning. You know, those we've seen some moves with the quarterbacks. We've seen some quarterbacks decide to stay. We've seen some quarterbacks that have moved on, or teams maybe that have moved on from their quarterbacks. And all that is going to do, Jack, is heat up the conversation surrounding the Minnesota Vikings, who have a quarterback who may stay, may go, who knows what the future is. But real quick, let's recap what the week has looked like. I think most people probably know this, but it started off with Aaron Rodgers signing or agreeing to the terms of a deal to stay with the Green Bay Packers. I guess we've since learned that maybe we don't know the exact terms of that deal, but the landscape of the NFC remains unshifted. The Green Bay Packers then franchise tag Davante Adams. They keep their core as far as the offense goes. They've got the two running backs we know about. What do you think this does for the NFC North, and were you surprised at all that Rodgers stayed with the Packers?
Not really. I think being in the state of Minnesota, I think we had to expect the worst, and that kind of is the worst, but it also sounds like, again, it's kind of weird because was reported that it was this massive, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was like a $200 million deal or something.
Report, like yeah.
$50 million a year. And then Rodgers, after what we're going to talk about in a little bit, the Russell Wilson tweet came out, and then Rodgers had to tweet his own news saying, hey, this isn't a done deal yet, but he is going to remain in Green Bay. He did confirm that. And I think what it means for the rest of the NFC North is the NFC North still runs through Green Bay. I know Vikings fans listening don't necessarily want to hear that, but this Vikings roster right now just doesn't match up with what the Packers have. And I think if that is true and it's a $50 million per year deal, you're going to see some long-term effects on the Packers side of things, similar to what the Vikings had with Kirk Cousins, where they're going to start losing some of these guys like a Zadarius Smith. It's going to be harder for them to pay guys like Jair Alexander because they have some superstars on the defense as well, similar to like kind of how the Vikings were built a couple years ago. So I think it remains the Packers division, but that is kind of short-sighted. And I'm not sure that I buy into this, even if he gets this 4-year deal, if he's not going to make a fit, if they reach the NFC championship game next year and lose that. I'm not super positive that Aaron Rodgers wouldn't go out and say, you know what, maybe this isn't what I wanted to do, because that's what we've seen the last 2 seasons. But it is confirmed for at least the foreseeable future. And like I said, I think it means the Packers are still the clear-cut favorite in the NFC North and maybe even the NFC.
All right. You know, again, you mentioned the money. That's the big question there. We don't know what the money is exactly. We don't know how it's spread out. The Packers have cap issues currently. Right now they do. They're giving a raise to Davante Adams. They're giving a raise to Aaron Rodgers. They're going to have to make some decisions, and that's going to impact that team elsewhere. At the end of the day, if you have Aaron Rodgers, you're always going to be competitive. That's the fact of the matter. You're always going to be competitive. So they're taking their risk. They're doing that. They're going to assume that people would maybe take a lower pay cut or a more of a pay cut to come to Green Bay to play with Aaron Rodgers and compete for an NFC championship game. and then lose and not get to the playoffs or the Super Bowl. We'll see. I mean, who knows? It does remain unchanged in the NFC North. The Vikings are number 2, and we'll see where that goes. A lot of things could change in the next couple of weeks. That could change everything from top to bottom there. So we'll see there. That's how that week started, Jack. The next domino to fall was the Russell Wilson trade. I believe it was Wednesday around lunchtime. We found out that Russell Wilson was getting traded to the Denver Broncos for a haul. 2 firsts, 2 seconds, a third, some players. And there are some people that don't think that was even enough for the Seahawks to get in return for Russell Wilson. Clearly, Russell wanted his way out of Seattle. We saw that last year going into the season with the questions around the offensive line, and he got injured. There was some struggles with Seattle. Their window looks like it may have been closed. And the Denver Broncos, who maybe missed out on Aaron Rodgers, take an opportunity to make a big splash and bring in a proven quarterback. I have feelings on this one. How do you feel about it, first off?
I think Seattle won the trade. I think especially if the reports were true that Russell Wilson didn't want to be a Seahawk any longer, I think they capitalized and they got a pretty good haul in return. And it's hard to knock what Denver's trying to do too, because you see what the Rams just did last year. They were willing to go out and spend some big bucks on Matthew Stafford. Looks like it worked for them with the Super Bowl. I think the Denver Broncos are a very good team, but they gave up a lot of future assets. So I think that's kind of interesting. The team right now is good enough to win with Russell Wilson, but at the end of the day, I don't know if Russell Wilson can be even labeled as the second best quarterback in that division. I think it kind of goes Mahomes and Justin Herbert, and Russell Wilson has certainly shown flashes in his prime where he has been up there as a top 5 quarterback in the league, but we saw him kind of fall off last year. I know there was the finger injury that kind of lingered a little bit, but Russell Wilson wasn't what we were used to seeing Russell Wilson be. Right. I mean, Vikings fans should know that. The Vikings beat Russell Wilson for the first time last season. That's something that they hadn't been able to do until that point. So I think he's kind of reached that peak, but we've seen it with like guys like Brett Favre, where people thought they had reached their peaks, and then they go and they get on a team with a lot better talent around them. And I think that's what's going to happen in Denver. They have a stacked wide receiver core. They lose a very good tight end and Noah Fant in the trade as well, which we didn't bring up. And like I said, I think at the end of the day, Seattle wins the trade, because if they were kind of going into that rebuild mode anyways, now they have an overhaul of draft capital and a couple solid players to kind of fill that void. But now they have a huge hole at the quarterback position, which I'm sure we'll get into in a little bit.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. The next opportunity was Carson Wentz getting traded from the Indianapolis Colts to the Washington Commanders. Now, the compensation was a little less. I believe it was a second and 2/3. One of those thirds could turn into a second, depending on how much he plays. But the big knock here, the big thing to note here, is that they're going to take on his entire contract. Something that might be important to Minnesota Vikings fans to pay attention to. This is what it looks like when a team takes on a large contract that maybe they don't want. This is the kind of compensation you get in return. So, the implications widespread here, I don't think are super, we don't really care about Washington. We don't really care about Indianapolis. But what it does do, Jack, is it opens up another opportunity for a team that needs a quarterback. The Indianapolis Colts as one there. You could say the Seattle Seahawks, they're more in a rebuild mode. They did get Drew Lock back in return for that trade. But I don't think they're going to overspend for a quarterback. But mainly, Jack, what this does is it takes a couple of the quarterbacks, or for sure one of them with Russell Wilson and 2 of them with Aaron Rodgers, that were potentially going to land other places, that could potentially hit the market, that could potentially work their way out of wherever they were, to a team that needs a quarterback or feels that they are a quarterback away. We've mentioned teams like Cleveland. We've mentioned teams like Pittsburgh. Now you can add Indianapolis to that mix. The Tennessee Titans have been discussed in that opportunity there. And what it leaves is Kirk Cousins as the most viable potential option for those teams to go out and get. The market is hot. Do you think, right now, I'm going to ask you, put your feet to the fire, do you think that Kirk Cousins will be traded?
Right now, feet to the fire, I will answer that question with a no. I think right now, the signs are pointing more and more towards Kirk Cousins being the starting quarterback in the year 2022 for the Vikings. Personally, I think you and I both agree on this. I think I would trade Kirk if a good enough offer presented itself. And just kind of going on value, I think Kirk is going to fall somewhere in between the two. I think that's pretty obvious. But I don't think the Vikings are going to be lowballed. I think they want to get true value out of Kirk Cousins. I know the contract is going to be kind of a difficult situation to work around, but I think a first rounder and maybe even a couple day 2 picks is kind of that range for Kirk, where you see Russell Wilson get a complete overhaul, a couple first, I think it was a couple seconds, and some players. I don't think Kirk is quite there. Obviously, I think Russell Wilson, I think we both agree on that Russell Wilson is a better quarterback than Kirk Cousins. But I think we also both agree that Kirk Cousins is a much better quarterback than Carson Wentz. I know the spending wasn't quite as much for Washington to make that trade. I don't think Washington would have ever been a willing trade participant given the history there with Kirk Cousins. But I will say this, it is interesting because the Vikings, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah said down at the Combine last week that they don't necessarily see this as a weak quarterback class. And I thought that was kind of interesting that he said that. And on top of it, I did confirm that they met with the top 5 quarterback prospects while they were there. I think that's a lot more of a due diligence type thing. It's not like, hey, the Vikings met with Matt Corral and Malik Willis, they're going to draft one of the two. I think they're just doing their due diligence and doing what a good new regime is going to do at the Combine. But at the end of the day, I don't think the Vikings would give up Kirk Cousins for a similar package to what the Colts got in return for Carson Wentz. I think they're going to demand more. And I think the market right now could push his value up towards something that would actually pique the interest of Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. But right now, I just don't think that's the case.
Yeah, and that's the X factor, right? We don't know Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. We don't know Kevin O'Connell. We don't know what they want to do. They have said the right things. They have said that they don't intend to trade Kirk Cousins, that they see him as part of this future. An interesting thing to note, I think Corey brought this up on the Power Trip the other day, that a week ago, Pete Carroll said that there is no intentions for the Seattle Seahawks to trade Russell Wilson. And a week later, they traded him. So none of those words mean much of anything. But at the same time, the one thing we do know is that we don't know. We don't know what their plan is. We don't know what that tipping point is. If an offer comes in, when does it become good enough to pull the trigger? Do you really think you're going to compete this year? Aaron Rodgers is still in the division. NFC is a little more open than the AFC is, necessarily speaking. But is this an opportunity for you to compete and just play out that contract? I think that for me personally, I've moved away from the opportunity to extend Kirk. That option right now has gone way down the pecking order for me. Trade has become a little more realistic. Play out the 1 year in the contract for $45 million or whatever. Just let that go and count your losses and use this year to build some pieces that you already have and then plan for the future. If you can trade for anything, get out from under that contract right now, maybe bring in a free agent this year and get ahead of the game there and then get some assets there. I think it needs to be more than Wentz, like you mentioned, but I don't need to get the Russell Wilson return. We're getting out from under that contract. That's the main point, right? That's the main thing. With Kirk or without Kirk, we're not winning a Super Bowl this year. I don't think we're fooling anybody. So do they just want to get out from under it and start the rebuild now, or do they wait a year and offset that for one more opportunity? Jack? I mentioned some team names. I mentioned the Steelers, the Titans, the Seahawks, the Colts. Who else did I mention? The Browns. So some opportunities of teams that might be considered a quarterback away. Is there another team that should be in that mix? Or who do you think is the next one that is going to be the next one to make a splurge? Now, I ask that because there's a couple week period here now between now and the NFL draft where teams are going to make moves, right? You have free agency opening up. You have the opportunity there for the NFL draft. And that's when teams start to make the decisions to get set up for next year. So there's a small window here. If you want to strike while the iron is hot and before teams start making other decisions on drafting and free agents, you need to strike quick. When does free agency start? Do you know the date off the top of your head?
Yeah, I think it's the 16th, which I think is next Wednesday.
Wednesday. So you've got a week. You've got less than a week to really strike now if you're going to do that before free agent. And there's not a ton of free agents. Quarterbacks, I'm not fooling anybody there. But teams start spending money. Teams start shaping money. Maybe teams want to get out from under contract. The Vikings want to get cap space to bring in free agents.
They have to do that.
You got 6 days. You're right. You got 6 days to start making some decisions. That includes Kirk Cousins. It includes maybe Adam Thielen, maybe Harrison Smith, maybe Danielle Hunter, some other situations there too. We're talking about Kirk. Go back to the question I asked before I sidetracked us here. Is there a team? Who do you think the next team is that makes a splash at quarterback across the board?
Yeah, that's interesting. And one other thing that we haven't brought up that was weird to me, apparently the Panthers were kind of laughing at the idea that there was ever a phone call made to the Vikings to inquire about Kirk Cousins. I thought that was interesting because that was a team, and I'm guilty of it as well. I have done mocks where I've traded away random future picks, acting like that was Kirk Cousins to get that 6th overall pick. But the fact that they're coming out and saying that, maybe they aren't as bought into that. I think reports are coming out that they're really monitoring the Deshaun Watson case, that I think there's going to be some news dropping on that, I believe tomorrow actually. But the most interesting one, and I just pulled up a tweet here, this was crazy to me because they just it doesn't seem like they're with the trade that they just made, it doesn't seem like they're in a good situation to trade for a quarterback like Kirk Cousins. But Michael Fabiano tweeted a quote saying, "I wouldn't be surprised if the Seahawks looked into a trade for Kirk Cousins." And it was Mike Duggar on Fantasy Dirt on Sirius XFM said that last night. And that I was like, that just seemed really weird to me because they just got all this draft capital. So they have the capital if they want to make a move for Kirk Cousins. But what's the difference between Kirk Cousins and Russell Wilson? And that's when I started to ask myself, I have a buddy that's a Seahawks fan, why aren't we asking? Maybe Russell Wilson was pushing to get out of Seattle a lot more than we've kind of been led on to believe. I don't have any proof to say or proof to back that up, but it's
we do though. We last year he kind of called them out and said you need to do something. Like he kind of started this process before last season. Am I mistaken in remembering that?
No, that is true. And it was kind of weird because I just feel like Russell Wilson is that type of guy where he doesn't want to be looked at as a person that's like forcing him his own way out. But maybe there were conversations had behind closed doors that we don't know too much about. And I've seen other tweets in similar fashion saying that Pete Carroll really thinks highly of Kirk Cousins. He's a 70-year-old coach for a Super Bowl winning team in the last decade. Like, Pete Carroll might not really want to be in rebuild mode. That might not be a scenario that he wants. I mean, he might be closer to wanting to retire. And again, this is all, there's no facts behind this, but he might be closer to wanting to retire than actually rebuilding a team from the ground up. So it's interesting that came up. I think other than that, the Steelers are another one worth monitoring because I think the Steelers have a roster that is good enough to win now with the right quarterback in place. And I think Kirk Cousins would be a huge upgrade over what they rolled out last year with what Ben Roethlisberger was. And then Cleveland, I think that's kind of the sneaky one of the group because it was mentioned prior to all of these with the Baker Mayfield rumors kind of circulating and them saying that Baker is their guy, the Vikings saying that Kirk is their guy. But at the end of the day, we know as Vikings fans, I think I've seen this tweeted out several times in the last week, there's truth to all rumors. Stephon Diggs made all of us very aware of that. And for the Vikings, I mean, there was tweets that kind of came up recently where Rick Spielman was saying down at the combine, we're not trading Stephon Diggs. That's not going to happen. Look what happened a couple weeks after. So I think it's fun. The reckless speculation is fun, but it's not always reckless because sometimes it comes into fruition. And I think if I got an alert right now saying Kirk Cousins was traded, it wouldn't surprise me. I'm not sitting up here and saying when I say I think Kirk Cousins is going to be the starter in 2022, that's not me saying that with like even 80, 75, 80% certainty. I'm still sitting probably around 60-40 somewhere because truthfully, with the new regime, none of us truly know. And I'm not going to be shocked either way.
Yeah, that 60-40 range is probably a good one. Shout out to the chat real quick because they're helping us out here with some teams that need quarterbacks. The Buccaneers, another team that needs a quarterback. Joshua, who joins us on Twitch every week, brings up another good point, too, about the Carolina organizational structure, I guess you could say. It's a mess, right? I mean, they were very close to firing their quarterback this year, so it wouldn't surprise me if different parts of that organization were laughing at the trade and different parts were interested in the trade. And maybe they want this season to tank, and they don't want to spend money on Kirk Cousins, as Joshua said. Have Sam Darnold finish out this year, and then they lose a bunch of games and they get rid of Matt Rule and they move on and they start their project over. So there's a lot of, this chess game within organizations that really gets played. There's a lot of pieces that go into that and a lot of things that we do or don't know. And you can't believe anything you hear, whether it's laughing, whether it's not interested in trading or we're going to keep a player. Take it all with a grain of salt because none of it is full truth. And even if it is truth at the time, somebody could come knocking on the door the next day with a deal that you can't turn down. You cannot turn down based on where you are, and you take that deal. So don't listen to anything right now. Have fun with the speculation. That's what we're doing today. It's a speculation show, Jack. Next week, we'll turn our attention heavy duty to the draft. I know you have some players you want to mention quick that stuck out to you in the combine that was wrapped up this last week. We're going to turn to the draft. We're going to have some guests on to kind of highlight some players that are coming up. We'll talk more about this new shift in style and coaching schemes for the Minnesota Vikings. But before we head out here, you did pay a lot of attention to the combine, I would imagine. Tell me what stood out to you, Vikings, where they're picking, and anyone who might fall to them. Again, you mentioned it. There's someone who will always fall further, and you can't expect it. But who should Vikings fans be familiarizing themselves with right now?
Yeah, I think it's going to be another year where, and this comes with most regimes across the NFL, and I think it's going to be another class where we're saying, make sure this is a best player available type situation. Don't force yourself into a need, because there's a lot of talent at positions of need that are going to go off the board in the top 15. And that could hurt the Vikings if they get to pick 12 and all those guys are gone. They could be looking at another situation where a trade back is likely. I think Trent McDuffie, the cornerback, out of the University of Washington, was a guy that I was super high on going into the combine. Came in and he measured a little bit smaller, and then he found himself on one of those, I'll call it a death chart. That's probably not the best name for it, but a chart where cornerbacks with similar arm length measurables where they were at in the NFL, let's just say it wasn't a good list to find yourself on. And he measured with pretty short arms, which is not a great thing for the cornerback position. So I think Derek Stingley and Sauce Gardner had a very good combine. And there were people saying they wouldn't be shocked to see him be one of the first players with their name called, which is kind of surprising. He might be out of our reach. Yeah, I don't necessarily feel confident that he's going to be there at 12 anymore. I think there was some situations where it was possible, but as of now, with a great combine, if he has a good pro day, I think that's kind of not going to happen. But the University of Georgia, I think you can look at any player from their roster, and the one that I wanted to focus on, there's a couple. Trayvon Walker, he's an edge rusher that I think should be on the radar for the Minnesota Vikings and their fans. He tested very well, but the one that I wanted to talk about, and the fun one to talk about that I'm sure you saw, was Jordan Davis. 6'6", 341 pounds, ran a 4.78 40-yard dash. A big boy like that should not be able to run a 40 time like that. And that was just insane to me. I played high school football. I think the best 40 I ever ran was like a 4.9999. So it just barely cracked 5 seconds. So I was not the fastest by any means, but seeing someone like that, I think I saw there's like some sort of like analytical following where they've tested the last 17,000 players to go through the combine. He tested as the second highest freak athlete in that time span, which is crazy, behind only Calvin Johnson. And he's a defensive tackle that's 340 pounds and 6'6". So that was by far the most impressive performance, in my opinion, of the combine. Another name worth monitoring, Christian Watson out of NDSU, wide receiver, ran a blazing fast 40-yard dash, super athletic, type of guy that can take the top off the defense. And I think the wide receiver position is another kind of sneaky one for this regime, especially when you have Adam Thielen and you look at his contract over the next couple of years. That's a contract that I'm not sure this new regime is going to want to be attached to. And on top of that, we're talking about running more 11 personnel with Kevin O'Connell coming in the building. Excuse me. They might need to look at another wide receiver as well. And the wide receiver class, good news for the Vikings and their fan base, super deep for like the third or fourth consecutive year in a row. I think there was like 8 or 9 players that ran sub 4.40s. That was kind of the most entertaining day. They were all just flying. So super deep wide receiver class, and there's a really good edge presence and cornerback presence in this draft class, which is all great news for the Minnesota Vikings.
Right. All good things for the Minnesota Vikings. Jack, we'll keep this episode, speculative episode, on the shorter side. I think the next couple of weeks we'll probably go longer. We'll dive into some in-depth coverage and talk to some people about their thoughts on where the Minnesota Vikings are. So we'll wrap this one up. I got to go do some prep and get ready for the big KFAN Eliminator tomorrow. I know we both have some other things to do, but thanks to everyone who's joining us in the chat and the live stream, this virtual live stream. It's a fun community that really helps make this podcast what it is, keeps us honest, keeps us corrected as we make mistakes and talk throughout the time as well, but also just makes it a fun give and take back and forth as well. And thanks to everyone who subscribes to the podcast as well. iHeartRadio, iTunes, wherever you get your favorite podcast, make sure you hit that subscribe and follow button, and you'll get alerted every time there's a new episode of the State of Purple podcast. Jack, I'm going to send you out with this little teaser for tomorrow's Eliminator, get you pumped up, get you amped up. up. Hopefully everyone can tune in at 7 a.m. to see me go head-to-head with Sauce, and then hopefully I win and can play at 8 o'clock again for game 400 before my retirement ceremony from the Initials game. I'll still be around. We'll still do the podcast. I'm still with the company. I'm not doing that. We're just taking a step back from Initials. So without further ado, Jack, thanks for your help with this episode of the State of Purple podcast, and hopefully we'll see everybody tomorrow morning for the KFAN Eliminator.
Seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side. Off by Diggs. Stay up. Oh my God.